Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Today, we dive into an incredible true story, Fleeing Chains, how a young slave became the most feared gunslinger in 1873 Texas. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Tons of research and real historical data went into uncovering this gripping tale. You won't want to miss it. From the very beginning, his life was marked by chains, both literal and metaphorical. Born into slavery in the American South, the young boy never knew freedom. His earliest memories were of relentless work in the fields, the sun scorching his back, and the harsh crack of the overseer's whip echoing across the cotton rows. There was no childhood in the traditional sense. Play was a luxury he could never afford. Even basic necessities like food and clothing were rationed and substandard, leaving him physically exhausted and constantly on edge. Family bonds offered little comfort. Parents, siblings, and relatives lived under the same oppressive control, often torn apart by sales or punishment, and moments of tenderness were fleeting. From a very young age, he had to learn the rules of survival: stay out of sight, avoid drawing attention, and obey commands. Even when it meant witnessing cruelty, he could do nothing to stop. Despite the brutality, sparks of resilience began to form. He observed carefully, noting patterns in the behavior of overseers, listening to whispered stories of escape from older slaves, and dreaming of a life beyond the plantation. These formative years, though marred by suffering, laid the foundation for the sharp instincts and fearlessness that would later define him as a gunslinger. The hardship of slavery was not just physical, it was a crucible that forged cunning, courage, and a relentless will to survive. Even as a child, he could feel the stirrings of something inside him that refused to be broken. While other boys might have accepted the cruel rhythm of plantation life, he began to question why he and his family were treated as property rather than human beings. Every lash, every stolen meal, every order barked by an overseer fueled a growing fire of rebellion within him. He started small, defying minor rules when no one was watching, hiding food for later, sneaking out of chores for even a few moments of freedom. Stories whispered by older slaves became seeds of possibility. They spoke of hidden paths, secret rivers, and the distant lands where freedom existed. Each story was a lifeline, a reminder that the world extended far beyond the fences, chains, and cotton fields. He listened, absorbing every detail, learning which routes were safest, which allies could be trusted, and how the land itself could aid in escape. At this stage, his rebellion was more mental than physical. He observed the weaknesses in those who held power, noting the times when guards were distracted or when the plantation's routines could be circumvented. He quietly trained his mind to calculate risks, anticipate danger, and imagine a life where he answered to no one. In the silence of the night, he practiced running through fields and woods, memorizing every tree, creek, and shadow that could shield him one day. By the time he was in his early teens, the desire for freedom was no longer a dream. It was an obsession. Every act of subtle defiance, every stolen glance at the horizon, built a resolve that could not be broken. The boy who once cowered under whips was slowly becoming a young man capable of taking the ultimate risk, leaving everything he had known behind to claim his life, and, ultimately, his legend. The moment of escape didn't come as a grand, heroic declaration. It came as a calculated risk born from years of careful observation. By now, he had learned the routines of the plantation like the back of his hand. When the guard's attention wavered, which gates were left unlatched, and which corners of the surrounding woods offered the best cover. The night he finally decided to run was moonless, a perfect cloak for someone who could not afford even a single misstep. Heart pounding, he slipped away from the quarters, where he had spent so many sleepless nights. Each step through the dirt paths felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The familiar sounds of the plantation, the distant barking of dogs, the creak of the main gate, the occasional shout of an overseer, reminded him of the consequences of failure. But the promise of freedom, imagined so vividly over the years, pushed him onward. Crossing into the dense forest beyond the fields was like stepping into another world. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig could have betrayed him, but it also provided a sense of empowerment he had never felt while shackled. Hunger gnawed at him, and his young body ached from years of labor, yet he moved with a single-minded determination that only desperation can inspire. The first night was the hardest. Sleep was impossible, for he feared the discovery that would mean recapture, and worse. He ate nothing but whatever he could forage, drank from streams, and kept moving, guided by the stars and the whispered instructions of those who had escaped before him. Every hour without capture reinforced a belief that freedom was not just a dream, it was attainable. This escape was more than a physical act, it was a rite of passage. With each mile he put between himself and the plantation, the boy who had been a slave began to shed the identity forced upon him. By the time dawn broke and the first light touched the treetops, he was no longer merely running from chains, he was running toward a destiny that would make him one of the most feared gunslingers in Texas. The night of his escape marked the birth of a legend forged in courage, cunning, and an unyielding desire for freedom. Once he broke free from the plantation, the real challenge began. Texas in 1873 was no safe haven for a runaway slave. It was a vast, untamed land filled with natural hazards, hostile towns, and men eager to collect a bounty. The young fugitive had no map, no money, and few allies. Every step forward was a test of his cunning, endurance, and courage. The terrain itself was merciless. He traversed sweltering plains, where the sun beat down relentlessly, rivers with swift current to sweep him away, and dense forests where wild animals lurked in the shadows. Nights were the only time he could travel safely, yet darkness brought its own dangers. Treacherous footing, the howl of predators, and the constant fear of discovery by bounty hunters patrolling the region. Each obstacle forced him to thinkly, adapt, and survive using instincts honed from years of watching and learning under the harshest conditions. He relied on every lesson learned in slavery: stealth, patience, observation. He hid in the thick brush during the day, moving only when the coast was clear. Streams provided water, abandoned cabins offered temporary shelter, and he learned to forage for wild fruits and roots to stave off hunger. But the journey was not just physical, it was a constant mental battle. Fear was his companion, gnawing at his resolve, reminding him of what he had left behind and what he could lose if captured. Encounters with people along the way were equally perilous. Most townsfolk were suspicious, and any hint of his presence could lead to violent confrontation or betrayal. He learned to read people quickly, gauging who could be trusted, and when silence was the safest course. Sometimes he observed from a distance, learning routes, town layouts, and the movements of lawmen, so he could avoid them entirely. The journey through Texas was more than a passage across land, it was a transformation. Every challenge, every narrow escape strengthened his resolve, sharpened his senses, and molded him into someone far more capable than the frightened boy who had left the plantation. By the time he began to encounter the first signs of human settlements where lawlessness was rampant, He had already become a master of survival, laying the foundation for the fearsome gunslinger he was destined to become. As he pressed further into Texas, the young fugitive quickly realized that the open land was not empty. Every town, crossroads, and river crossing could hold danger. Bounty hunters, paid handsomely for returning runaway slaves, roamed relentlessly, often armed and experienced in tracking desperate men. Lawmen, too, were not always allies. In many frontier towns, the lines between justice and self-interest blurred, and a young black boy on his own was seen as either trouble or profit. Every step he took had to be calculated with precision. The first encounter came unexpectedly. A lone rider spotted movement near a creek and drew a pistol. The boy froze for a moment, heart hammering, before remembering the lessons learned on the plantation. Stay calm, read your opponent, and use the terrain. Ducking into the thick brush, he allowed the hunter to pass, silently marking the man's patterns for the future. That moment taught him the vital importance of patience and strategy over brute force. Not all encounters could be avoided. On more than one occasion, he had to fight to survive. Using whatever he could, sticks, rocks, or the first crude firearms he managed to get his hands on, he defended himself. Every confrontation honed his reflexes, sharpened his instincts, and made him increasingly dangerous. Stories of a lone, shadowy figure capable of eluding capture began to spread along the routes bounty hunters traveled, building the early whispers of the Gunslinger he would become. He also learned to manipulate fear as a weapon. By moving silently, appearing unexpectedly, and sometimes leaving signs of his presence, broken branches, disturbed tracks, or a shadow in the distance, he could unsettle even the most seasoned trackers. Over time, this earned him a reputation not only as elusive, but as cunning and unpredictable, qualities that would terrify those who dared to hunt him. These encounters were brutal schooling in the laws and lawlessness of the West. Every close call, every gun drawn, every narrow escape taught him that survival wasn't just about skill with weapons. It was about understanding human nature, anticipating danger, and striking only when necessary. By the time he left the first region of Texas, he was no longer just a runaway. He was a ghost on horseback, a name whispered with both fear and awe in the growing frontier towns. In the lawless expanse of Texas, survival demanded more than cunning. It demanded mastery of weapons. The young fugitive, once only familiar with the crude tools of plantation life, now faced a new reality. The ability to defend himself could mean the difference between freedom and death. His first encounter with a firearm was as much a necessity as it was a revelation. A chance meeting with a traveling gunsmith taught him the basics, and from that moment, a new skill set began to take shape. Learning to handle a gun was not easy. The weight, the recoil, the intricate mechanics, all of it required patience, discipline, and relentless practice. He began with small caliber pistols, firing at targets in abandoned fields or along riverbanks. Each misfire or misstep became a lesson in focus, precision, and control. Slowly, he developed a natural rhythm, combining his sharp instincts with careful observation. The boy who had once fled for his life now trained to ensure he could survive any threat that crossed his path. But firearms were only part of the equation. Survival in the wild demanded ingenuity. He honed skills that earlier had been mere curiosity, tracking footprints, identifying edible plants, and reading the weather and terrain for signs of danger. He learned to move silently, to make no noise that could betray his presence, and to use natural cover to his advantage. At night, he studied the patterns of the land, memorizing creek bends, hills, and hidden paths, creating a mental map that made pursuit nearly impossible. His growing proficiency with weapons and survival tactics made him increasingly confident, but he never allowed overconfidence to creep in. Every day was a lesson in humility. A misjudged shot, a poorly chosen hiding spot, or a moment's hesitation could mean capture or death. Over time, these skills coalesced into a deadly combination: a young man who could disappear into the wilderness, strike with precision when necessary, and leave even the most experienced bounty hunters frustrated and fearful. By the time he reached the outskirts of the more populated frontier towns, he was no longer just a runaway, he was a formidable force. His mastery of firearms, paired with a keen understanding of survival, laid the foundation for his reputation as one of the most feared gunslingers of Texas. The boy who had once been chained to a plantation was evolving into a shadow of legend, unseen, unstoppable, and unafraid. As he moved deeper into Texas, frontier towns became both opportunity and danger. These rough settlements were filled with drifters, outlaws, lawmen of questionable loyalty, and townsfolk who had long since learned that survival often required keeping one's eyes and mouth shut. For the young fugitive, these towns were a proving ground, a place where skill, cunning, and courage could transform him from a shadowy figure into a legend. His reputation began quietly, through whispers and fleeting sightings. A man who could handle himself in a fight, disappear without a trace, and strike fear into those who underestimated him became a story told around saloons and campfires. Early encounters were small but telling: a stolen horse from a corrupt rancher, a quick gun duel with a rowdy gunslinger, or the clever outsmarting of a local thug trying to extort him. Each incident was carefully measured. He understood that reckless violence would draw too much attention, but calculated action could cement a reputation far greater than any boast. Word spread quickly in these tightly knit communities. Traders, drifters, and bounty hunters carried tales of the mysterious young gunslinger, a man who appeared out of nowhere, dealt justice on his own terms, and vanished before anyone could respond. Fear and respect grew in equal measure. Those who crossed him learned to tread carefully, while those seeking protection or guidance began to seek his presence. Townsfolk whispered about his courage, his deadly aim, and the eerie calm with which he faced danger. Beyond his gunfighting skills, he built alliances that strengthened his position. He befriended other outcasts, sharing knowledge of the land, escape routes, and survival tactics. Together, they formed a network that allowed him to move with greater confidence, knowing that information and support were never far away. These alliances were strategic, chosen with precision to avoid betrayal and ensure survival. By the time he had spent months moving from town to town, his reputation was no longer confined to whispered stories. It was a force of its own. People began to remember his face, the way he carried himself, and the sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Lawmen hesitated to confront him. Outlaws thought twice before challenging him, and ordinary citizens couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and fear. In these frontier towns, he was no longer just a runaway slave. He was becoming a legend in his own right, a young man whose name would one day echo across Texas as the most feared gunslinger of his era. It wasn't long before the young gunslinger's growing reputation drew attention, both feared and challenged. In the frontier towns of 1873 Texas, respect was earned through action, and duels were the ultimate proving ground. Unlike staged showdowns, these confrontations were raw, dangerous, and often deadly. Each duel tested his reflexes, courage, and cunning, shaping him into the figure who would terrify and command the West. His first true gunfight was born of necessity. A local outlaw, boasting of his own deadly skills, attempted to rob a small trading post where the young man had sought refuge. Calm and precise, he stepped forward, not with anger, but with calculated awareness. Every movement was deliberate. In the split second before the first shot, he assessed his opponent's stance, gauged the environment, and positioned himself to maximize both cover and advantage. The shots rang out, echoing through the wooden buildings. Within moments, the outlaw lay defeated, and the stunned onlookers whispered a name they would never forget. Word of his first victories spread like wildfire. Frontier towns talked about the young gunslinger who could outdraw seasoned outlaws, predict their moves, and strike with unerring accuracy. Each subsequent duel became a story in itself, a tense standoff outside a saloon, a midnight ambush on a dusty road, a clever escape from a gang intent on revenge. Each encounter reinforced the narrative. He was unpredictable, precise, and merciless when necessary, yet never reckless. What set him apart was not just his skill with firearms, but his understanding of fear as a weapon. He learned to use the psychology of the duel, the pause, the glare, the quiet that preceded action. Opponents often hesitated, second-guessing themselves, while he remained calm, calculating, and ready. His ability to stay composed under pressure made him legendary among those who relied on bravado and brute force. By the end of 1873, the young fugitive's name had become synonymous with deadly precision. Tales of his duels traveled from town to town, exaggerated by storytellers but grounded in truth. People didn't just fear his aim, they feared the shadow of the man himself, the quiet confidence, and the knowledge that he had survived against impossible odds before. These notorious confrontations solidified his transformation from a runaway boy into the most feared gunslinger in Texas, a living legend whose story would echo long after the smoke of his first duels had cleared. In the rugged, lawless expanse of Texas, survival wasn't just about skill with a gun. It was also about knowing who to trust and who to avoid. The young gunslinger quickly learned that even the most feared men had networks, and that alliances could mean the difference between life and death. He began forming bonds with other outlaws, men and women who had been cast out of society, each with their own skills, grudges, and codes. These alliances were strategic, born out of necessity rather than friendship, but they allowed him to navigate a world that was otherwise hostile and unpredictable. These partnerships were delicate. Trust was scarce, and betrayal could come at any moment. He learned to gauge loyalty by observing behavior, listening to whispers, and testing reactions in small ways before fully committing to collaboration. Some alliances involved shared protection, watching each other's backs during dangerous runs, pooling knowledge about lawmen and bounty hunters, or coordinating efforts in ambushes or hastes. Others were more about mutual respect, dueling champions who recognized his skill, offering guidance or mentorship in exchange for honor and reputation. But alliances were only one side of the coin. Rivalries with other outlaws were inevitable, and he quickly discovered the deadly consequences of being underestimated or challenged. Some rivals attempted to assert dominance through intimidation or ambush, forcing him to confront threats not just with firepower, but with strategy and cunning. These confrontations honed his ability to anticipate betrayal, recognize weakness, and exploit opportunities before his enemies even realized they existed. Each rivalry became another lesson, sharpening both his instincts and his reputation. Over time, he developed a network of allies and cautious acquaintances, a web that stretched across the frontier towns of Texas. This network allowed him to move freely, gain intelligence, and strike with precision while remaining elusive. Allies would provide safe shelter, warn of approaching danger, or even intervene in a duel when necessary. Yet, he never relied entirely on anyone. Independence remained his greatest asset. By balancing alliances with rivalries, he established himself as a force that others respected, feared, or envied. Outlaws learned that crossing him carried a steep price, while those smart enough to cooperate gained an invaluable ally. This delicate dance between friendship and enmity not only ensured his survival, but also cemented his standing as one of the most formidable gunslingers in Texas. He was no longer just a shadow fleeing chains. He had become a strategic, feared, and respected figure in the chaotic world of the frontier. Life as a fugitive and gunslinger came at a steep price, not just physically, but mentally. Every day was a test of endurance, every encounter a potential death sentence. The young man who had once fled the plantation now carried the weight of constant vigilance. Trust was a rare commodity. Betrayal could be deadly, and even allies could turn on him in a heartbeat. This relentless tension left deep marks on his mind, shaping him as much as the harsh landscape of Texas did. Fear was a constant companion. He never knew who might be watching, who might be lying in wait, or when the next gunfight would erupt. Every town, every dusty road, every shadowed alley held the possibility of ambush. Even in moments of relative calm, he would scan horizons for signs of movement, listen for whispers in the wind, and calculate escape routes with obsessive precision. Sleep came in fragmented bursts, always one ear alert, one eye on danger. Over time, this hyper-awareness became instinctual, but it also eroded any sense of ease or normalcy. Loneliness compounded the psychological strain. While alliances and friendships offered brief relief, they were always measured, cautious, and fraught with the potential for betrayal. Genuine companionship was almost impossible. Intimacy was a luxury he could not afford. He often wrestled with isolation, haunted by memories of the family and freedom he had left behind. The boy who once played in fields now navigated a world of suspicion, violence, and moral compromise, and the solitude of his journey weighed heavily on his spirit. Yet, it was in this crucible of danger and distrust that his mind sharpened. He became a master of strategy and anticipation, learning to read people, predict behavior, and make decisions under extreme pressure. Every close call, every betrayal, and every narrow escape strengthened his resolve and honed his instincts. The psychological toll was severe, but it also forged a mental resilience unmatched by most men in Texas. By the time he had solidified his reputation as a feared gunslinger, the young man was both battle-hardened and mentally disciplined. He had learned to transform fear into focus, distrust into strategy, and isolation into self-reliance. The constant psychological strain was not merely a burden, it was a forge that tempered him into the legend he was becoming, a man whose reputation alone could unsettle enemies and command respect across the frontier. As word of his daring exploits spread across Texas, the young gunslinger became more than just a shadow in the wilderness. He became a story. Local townsfolk, traders, and travelers began sharing whispers of his deeds, exaggerating details with each retelling. In a world hungry for legends, these stories spread quickly, and soon he was no longer merely a fugitive or an outlaw. He was a symbol of fear, skill, and defiance. The press, even in its fledgling frontier form, caught wind of the tales. Newspapers in small towns ran stories of the mysterious young gunslinger, who could outdraw anyone, vanish without a trace, and confront even the most dangerous outlaws with deadly precision. Headlines described duels that sounded almost mythical, ambushes that defied logic, and escapes that left bounty hunters baffled. While some reports were sensationalized, The underlying truth could not be denied. This young man was fast, cunning, and feared across the region. Locals had a complicated relationship with him. For many townspeople, he was a figure of awe, a protector in some instances, a danger in others. Shopkeepers, saloon owners, and ranchers who had witnessed his skill firsthand knew not to provoke him, but they also respected his independence and the code he seemed to follow. Rumors spread that he sometimes assisted those in need, taking what he required from those who could afford to lose and leaving others unharmed, a strange blend of Robin Hood and relentless gunslinger. Fear amplified his legend. Even those who had never seen him feared encountering him in a dark alley or along a lonely trail. Stories of his ruthlessness in duels and his cunning in eluding capture circulated in taverns and trading posts, growing with each telling. Children whispered his name in awe, while adults steeled themselves at the thought of crossing paths with the young man who had turned survival into an art form. By the end of 1873, the combined effect of word of mouth, press reports, and local lore had elevated him from a fugitive to an almost mythical figure. He was no longer just a young man fleeing slavery. He had become a symbol of fear, skill, and independence. The frontier towns of Texas knew his name. The stories of his exploits became part of their culture, and his legend began to outgrow the man himself. A young slave who had escaped bondage now feared and revered as the most dangerous gunslinger of his time. By the time the young gunslinger's story had circulated through Texas, his life had become more than a series of daring escapes, duels, and alliances. It had become legend. His legacy was twofold. He had left an indelible mark on the culture of lawlessness that defined the frontier, and he had become a symbol of resistance, cunning, and resilience that would echo through folklore for generations. In the immediate sense, his actions directly influenced the behavior of other outlaws and lawmen alike. His uncanny ability to elude capture, combined with his precision in gunfights, set new standards for what it meant to survive and dominate in Texas. Bounty hunters grew more cautious, gangs became more strategic, and towns learned that the line between safety and chaos could be measured by the presence or rumor of a gunslinger. In this way, he shaped the tactics, myths, and even the unwritten rules of frontier life. Beyond the practical, his story became a narrative that transcended fear. In the taverns, trading posts, and homes of Texas, tales of the fugitive turned gunslinger were retold with embellishments and awe. Children grew up hearing of the young man who had escaped slavery, mastered firearms, outsmarted bounty hunters, and challenged the lawless without hesitation. His life became a story that blurred the lines between history and folklore, inspiring generations to admire bravery, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. Writers, storytellers, and eventually historians would continue to revisit his exploits, fascinated by how a boy born into chains could rise to command such respect and fear. His life became a touchstone for discussions about justice, survival, and the complexity of morality in a lawless land. He symbolized the possibility of rising above oppression, not just with strength of arms, but with intelligence, strategy, and sheer willpower. Even decades later, the echoes of his legend remained in Texas culture. Local lore preserved his name, his duels were romanticized in stories, and his strategies studied by those seeking to understand the interplay of fear, skill, and reputation. In every retelling, the essence of the gunslinger remained: a boy who fled bondage, mastered danger, and left a mark on the American frontier that time could not erase. His life was a testament to survival, to ingenuity, and to the enduring power of legend. A young man whose journey from slavery to feared gunslinger became one of the most compelling stories in the history of Texas lawlessness.